The homeowners association of a subdivision I do not live in, have never lived in, and have never once agreed to anything with, sent me a formal notice of violation on a Tuesday. The violation was my lake. I read it twice standing at the mailbox and then a third time in the truck because I wanted to be certain I wasn't being generous with them. I wasn't. The Hartley Shores Homeowners Association had determined that the water level of the adjacent lake feature was out of compliance with community standards, that it was adversely impacting resident lawn conditions and enjoyment, and that I was assessed a fine of $200 with $50 per day accruing until the condition was corrected. It was signed by the board president. There was a little logo of a heron on the letterhead. I want to tell you honestly that it was the best thing that had happened to me in about a year. My name is Wade Ostrom. I'm 58. My family has run cattle in this valley since before Montana was a state, which is not a boast, it's a legal fact that ended up mattering enormously. But the part of my resume that mattered more was the 21 years I spent as a ditch rider for the irrigation district. The man who drives the ditches, opens and closes the head gates, measures the flow, and makes sure the water going onto your hay is water you're actually entitled to. 21 years of that teaches you two things. Every water decree in the valley, by heart, because your job is knowing whose turn it is, and that there is no lie a grown man won't tell you, standing in the mud, holding a shovel, with your water running onto his field. The lake isn't really a lake. It's a pond of about 11 acres, made by a dam my great-great-grandfather built out of glacial till and stubbornness in 1889. And the water right that comes with it carries that same date. In Montana, water runs on prior appropriation, first in time, first in right. That date is older than the state. It's older than the county. It is, functionally, the oldest thing in this valley that isn't a mountain. And it means that in a dry August, when everybody downstream is calling the water commissioner and crying, my water gets delivered first and theirs gets shut off. Not because I'm a nice man, because of a number written on a piece of paper in 1889. That pond is also the only reason 200 head of cattle survive a Montana August. There's no city water out here. The pond is the water. Everything I'm about to tell you sits on top of that fact. I have a routine, and I want you to notice it now so it pays you back later. Every morning with coffee, I walk the 200 yards down to the dam and read the staff gauge. A steel rod set in concrete at the outlet, painted in tenths of a foot, and I write the number in a spiral notebook with the date and the time. Every single day for 21 years, including the 4 years since I retired, when nobody was paying me to do it. My wife, before she passed, called it my rosary. It is the single most boring habit a man can have. Keep it in mind. Two other things from that first spring are worth mentioning, and at the time I'd have said neither was worth a sentence. 1. I'd zip-tied a game camera to a cottonwood overlooking the dam, because every year the beavers come down and try to build in my spillway, and I'd rather know in April than find out in June. 2. Twice a year, a woman from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks drove out, waded my pond with a net and a clipboard, measured fish, clipped little fin samples, and had me sign a form I confess I never read closely. Her name was Dr. Halverson. She always brought her own coffee, which I respected. And then they built Hartley Shores. 41 houses on the flat below my north fence line, marketed hard, and I mean hard, as waterfront living. Signs on the highway with a heron on them. That heron was doing a lot of work in that development. Every one of those houses was sold with a view of my pond, and every buyer was told, one way or another, that they were buying a lake. Nobody told them the lake had a deed with my name on it. Nobody told them the water was spoken for by a dead man in 1889. And nobody, this is the part that would eventually cost them everything, nobody told them the ground down there is a great deal wetter than it looks. Their first summer was fine. Their second was wet. My pond came up to full pool the way it does in a wet year. The low ground along their north row went soft, and lawns started yellowing at the edges. And somewhere in there, in a clubhouse, a group of people who had bought a view decided the view was theirs to manage. Which brings us to the notice. and to Corinne Pratt. Corey Pratt was 52, president of that board, and, hold on to this, the real estate agent who had sold roughly half those houses. She'd built her entire book of business on that shoreline, so when the shoreline started making her clients unhappy, it wasn't a lawn problem to her. It was a mirror. I went down there exactly once because I believe in giving a man one honest conversation before you stop giving him conversations. I brought my deed, the decree, and a plat map, and I explained it in the flattest English I own. The pond is on my land, the dam is my structure, the water is my right. That right dates to 1889, and the association's authority stops at the association's boundary. I said I was sympathetic about the lawns, that I hadn't made it rain, and that I couldn't lower my pond by vote any more than they could raise it by one. Corey listened with her arms folded and her head tipped, and then she said the sentence I'd end up hearing again, much later, standing somewhere considerably worse for her. "Mr. Ostrom," she said, "that water is the view these people paid for. At this point it's a community asset, whether you like it or not." I said that it wasn't, and I went home. 2 weeks later I received, in the mail, the minutes. They'd put it on the agenda. There'd been a motion. There'd been a second. The Hartley Shores Homeowners Association had voted, 9 in favor, 1 abstention, 1 absent, that the lake level shall be maintained at a reduction of 3 feet from current elevation. They voted on my pond. They mailed me the tally like a bill, and the secretary, bless her thoroughness, had recorded the president's remarks in full, including the part about the community asset. I framed that page. It's on the wall of my shop right now. But I also did the one thing I always did as a ditch writer, which is warn a man once, in writing, so afterward nobody has to wonder whether he knew. I sent Corey Pratt a certified letter, 3 sentences long. The pond, dam, and water right were my private property. Any interference would be reported and prosecuted. And the third sentence, which I wrote plainly because I meant it plainly. A dam holds water in one direction. Water goes downhill. Do not touch my dam. They touched my dam. They started with a committee, because of course they did. The association formed a lake committee, a thing you can apparently form for a lake you don't own. And one Saturday morning in July, the lake committee came to inspect my dam by kayak. 4 of them. Bright plastic boats, life vests, clipboards, and gallon freezer bags. I was on the dam having my coffee and reading the gauge, and I watched this flotilla paddle across my own water toward me with the grim purpose of a Normandy landing. I met them at the outlet. I explained that they were on private property. They were. I owned the pond bed and every drop above it, and that they were welcome to turn around. A gentleman named Doug informed me the committee had a mandate to assess. I said his mandate ended at my fence and asked him, courteously, to show me the part of his covenant that covered my great-great-grandfather. He didn't care for that. He put a hand on the concrete and started climbing out of his kayak onto my dam, and I put my boot on the bow and pushed it back out about 4 feet, which is a very small motion that has a very large effect on a man who's halfway out of a boat. Doug went in the water. It's 3 feet deep at the outlet. He came up furious and standing, which robbed the moment of some of its drama. The clipboard did not survive. The freezer bag was, I noted, not correctly sealed. The committee retreated in disarray and left a paddle, which I still have, and which I have offered to return at any time, in writing twice. 10 days later, their consultant's report arrived. 4 pages declaring my dam structurally compromised and an imminent hazard requiring immediate drawdown. I read it in 10 minutes. He'd never set foot on my property, you could tell, because he described a spillway on the wrong end. He cited a seepage rate he couldn't have measured, and he recommended a drawdown of, appreciate this, exactly 3 feet, not 2, not 4, precisely the number that had passed 9-1 at a meeting 6 weeks earlier. That report wasn't an engineering opinion. It was a receipt. Then the pipes came. The first morning I knew before I got to the dam, because I'd been reading that gauge for 21 years, and I could see the shoreline was wrong from 100 yards out. 2/10 down overnight. 2/10 in July, no wind, no call on the river, is not evaporation. It's theft.
I walked the crest and found it. A siphon. 40 feet of black 4-inch pipe laid over the top of my dam, one end in my pond, the other running down the backside toward their side. Somebody had primed it. It was pulling my water, quietly, all night, downhill and away. I hauled it out and threw it in the willows. The next night there were 3.
The night after, 5, and one was a proper 6-inch line with a foot valve, which meant somebody had gone to a supply store and spent real money. I pulled them all. I wasn't enjoying this, though I was enjoying it a little. There's a particular satisfaction in a war where your enemy has to sneak onto your property in the dark to lose to gravity, and where every morning you undo their whole night with a pair of gloves. But water is not a game. My gauge log has that fortnight in it, in my own handwriting. 2/10, 4/10, 7/10, a foot and a tenth. 200 head of cattle don't care whose fault it is. Every tenth those people stole in the dark was a day in August I wasn't going to have. So on the 4th day I did what I should have done first, which was go look at the camera I'd hung for the beavers. I hung that camera to catch rodents. It caught something considerably dumber. 40-some frames in green and white infrared. Doug and 2 other men wrestling pipe over the crest of my dam at 1 in the morning, and behind them, holding a flashlight and pointing where to lay it, in a fleece vest with a heron embroidered on it, Corinne Pratt. President of the board, time-stamped, her face lit up plain as noon by her own light. I made 3 copies of everything, the camera card, the gauge log, my certified letter, and their own minutes voting to lower a pond they didn't own, and called the Department of Natural Resources, and then the water commissioner for the district, who happened to be a man I'd trained. Ray Fenno came out on a Wednesday. Ray is 60-something and has the expression of a man who has heard every excuse there is, twice, and never once found a new one interesting. He walked the crest, looked at the drag marks in the grass, looked at my log, looked at a photograph of a board president holding a flashlight over a siphon at 1 in the morning, and sighed the sigh of a public servant who now has paperwork. The state issued a cease and desist to the Hartley Shores Homeowners Association within the week. In writing, delivered, signed for. It ordered them, in language a child could follow, to cease any and all interference with the Ostrom Dam, outlet works, and a pertinent water right, and warned that further interference would be referred for enforcement. And here's where I got genuinely confused, because I'm a slow man, but I'm not a stupid one. Nobody does this for a lawn. They'd voted publicly, hired a consultant, trespassed by boat, run siphons at night in a fleece vest with a heron on it, and eaten a state cease and desist, all over yellow grass on the low end of a subdivision. People do not commit crimes at 1 in the morning over turf. Whatever those 3 feet were worth, it was worth more than lawns, and not knowing what kept me up nights. Dr. Halverson answered the question I hadn't thought to ask. She was out that August for her sampling, and I mentioned, mostly as a joke, that I'd been fighting a homeowners association over my water level. She stopped with the net half out of the pond and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Then she explained, patiently, the way you'd explain to a man who's been signing forms for 6 years without reading them, what my pond actually is. West Slope cutthroat trout, genetically pure, no hybridization, the real thing, which is nearly gone from this drainage because a century of stocking has crossbred them into mush everywhere the water connects. My pond doesn't connect. My great-great-grandfather's dam made an accidental island of water in 1889, and the fish in it have been sitting there ever since like something in a jar. For 6 years, my pond had been an official conservation refuge population, a genetic ark for the entire valley, and the forms I'd been signing were the agreement. Those fish weren't my fish. They were the state's fish, in my water, and there's a schedule for them. If something happened to that pond, she said slowly, they'd count them, individually. The second question got answered by a man named Errol Vance, who lived in the 3rd house on the low row and came up my road one evening with a 6-pack and the specific misery of a man who's figured out he bought into something. Errol had a wet basement, a bad feeling, and no vote worth casting. What he told me was this. The association had a state septic inspection on the calendar for the 22nd of September. The board had been strange about it for months, and the drain field behind his house had smelled like a mistake since the day he moved in. That was enough of a thread. Septic permits are public record in this county. Anybody can walk into the environmental health office and pull the file for a subdivision, which is a thing almost nobody knows and everybody should. I spent a morning there with a clerk and a copier, laid the as-built elevations for 41 drain fields next to my own gauge readings, and then sat in my truck in that parking lot for a while. Hartley Shores has no municipal sewer. Every home runs a septic system, and a septic system needs a drain field, and a drain field needs unsaturated soil beneath it, dry ground, a few feet of it, for the effluent to filter through before it reaches groundwater. That's the whole point. That's the only thing standing between a subdivision and its own sewage. Their drain fields were installed too low, down on the flat in the wet ground, at an elevation that only works if my pond is down. At full pool, the water table under Hartley Shores comes up into those fields, and 41 houses worth of effluent goes into saturated soil, unfiltered, and travels downhill. Into the pond, into the lake, into the amenity, into the view they were selling. It had been happening quietly for 2 summers. That was the 3 feet, not lawns, never lawns. If my pond dropped 3 feet, the water table dropped with it, the fields dried out, and 41 systems passed inspection instead of failing catastrophically, which would mean an engineered fix, a special assessment of a size that ends careers, and a disclosure problem for every agent who'd ever sold a house down there, which was, by her own count, roughly half of them, and belonged to one woman. They weren't protecting a view. They were trying to lower a lake to hide what they'd been putting in it. I sat with that a long minute, and then, God help me, I laughed, because it's the most beautifully stupid thing I've ever heard. They were poisoning their own amenity, and their solution was to steal enough of it that the evidence would dry out. On the 18th, 4 days before the inspection, they brought the excavator. I heard it before I saw it, that diesel knock coming up my own access road, and by the time I got down there it was already tracking out onto the crest of my dam, a mid-size machine on rubber tracks, with Corey Pratt walking ahead of it like a woman leading a parade, Doug behind her, and a knot of lake committee down on the bank with their arms crossed. I want to be precise about what I did, because it matters. I did not stand in front of the bucket. I've known too many dead heroes. I walked to the outlet, checked my gauge, wrote the number and the time in my notebook. 9:40 in the morning, full pool, 4/10 over the crest, and turned my phone on and held it up. And then I said the only thing I had left, which was the same thing I'd said in a certified letter 3 months before. That dam holds 130 years of water, I said. It holds it in one direction. Everything downhill of it is downhill. Corey told me I was trespassing, on my dam, on my land. I let that one go by. The operator was a kid, maybe 25, and he leaned out of the cab and asked the smartest question anybody asked that entire year. "Ma'am," he said, "is this your property?" And Corinne Pratt, standing on a structure she did not own, holding a state cease and desist order she had personally signed for, in front of a man with a phone up, said, "I'm the president of the board. Dig." He dug. The first bucket took the top off the spillway lip, and nothing much happened, and I watched them relax. The second went deeper and pulled a wet mess of till and cobble out of the crest, and a dark seep came up in the scar like blood in a cut, and I saw the kid in the cab notice it. The third bucket is the one I'll be thinking about when I'm dying, because the dam didn't break. Breaking is loud and fast and cinematic. What my great-great-grandfather's dam did was give up. The scar went dark, then went wide, and then 130 years of stored water found the hole and simply began to leave. It made a sound I can only describe as a sigh, followed about 4 seconds later by a roar, and 11 acres of pond went from a lake to a river in the time it takes to understand what you're looking at. Water goes downhill. I'd told them in person. I'd told them by certified mail. I'd told them 90 seconds earlier with a phone in my hand. Downhill was the old creek channel, a dry, grassy swale for a century because the dam has been holding water off it since 1889, which is precisely why it looked like such a lovely, flat place to build. Hartley Shores had put their brand new lakeside pavilion in it, their beach amenity, their pump house, their kayak racks. The pavilion went first, and I'll say this for it, it went beautifully. It didn't smash, it lifted off its piers, rotated a slow quarter turn with what I can only call dignity, and set off downstream fully intact, still flying its little pennant flags like a party leaving early. The kayak racks fed the flood 4 bright plastic boats, one at a time, and the lake committee stood on the bank and watched their own fleet paddle away without them, which I consider one of the finest images of my life. The pump house folded up like a cardboard box. The kid on the excavator did the correct and only thing, which was scramble out of the cab and up onto the boom, where he sat above a torrent of brown water, holding his phone over his head, filming. And that's how the machine stayed, canted in the breach, for 2 days, with a young man's baseball cap on the seat. Corey ran. She ran along the bank toward the clubhouse, in good shoes, on wet grass, and she did not make it, because you cannot outrun water on its own ground. She got maybe 60 yards before the flat took the flood, and she had to climb a fence and stand on the rail and watch her subdivision get its lake at last, all at once, in the wrong place. And then, as the pond drained down and the flow slackened, and the whole thing went from catastrophe to consequence, the mud came out of the water. 11 acres of bare grey silt, steaming a little in the September sun, with dying fish on it. Hundreds of them, bright and thrashing and then not. And exposed along the flat below Hartley Shores, out of the water for the first time in 2 years, sat 41 drain fields, black, slumped, and reeking in the open air, in full view of the county road. I walked down off my dam and out onto my own mud, and I stopped at the fence where Corey Pratt was still standing on the bottom rail with her hand over her mouth, looking at the smell of her subdivision. "Mrs. Pratt," I said, "that water was the view these people paid for." She looked at me. "You told me it was a community asset," I said, "whether I liked it or not." I nodded out at 41 open drain fields lying in the sun. "There it is. That's the asset. It's been in the lake the whole time." She didn't say anything. I've thought about that a lot. In 3 months, it's the only time that woman didn't have a sentence ready. At 11:20 that morning, 1 hour and 40 minutes into this, the state septic inspector's truck turned into the subdivision 4 days early because he'd finished another job and thought he'd get a head start. I've thought a great deal about whether I deserve any credit for the timing, and I'm at peace with the conclusion that I don't. That was the universe. I just had a good seat. The wardens came within the hour. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks game wardens are not a nature club. In Montana, they're sworn peace officers with arrest authority, and that board had prepared for many possibilities that morning, but not for that one. I watched a woman in a green uniform explain to a real estate agent in a heron vest what the words "unlawful destruction of a fisheries refuge population" meant, and I watched Corey reach for the only tool she'd ever had, which was to say, loudly, that she was the president of the board. Then they counted the fish. This is my favorite part, and I say that as a man who lost his pond. They counted them, individually. 2 wardens, a bucket, and a tally counter, walking the mud in waders all afternoon, clicking. Because restitution for a state fisheries resource is assessed per specimen, and for a genetically pure refuge population, it's assessed per specimen at a rate that would make you sit down. One of them worked a calculator on the tailgate while the other called out the count, and every time the number came up, somebody from the lake committee made a small sound. It took until dusk. Nobody rushed. The clicking went on and on and on, over the mud, in the quiet, and I don't believe anybody in that association had ever in their lives had a consequence arrive 1 click at a time. The rest is bookkeeping. My gauge log put the timeline down to the 10th of a foot. In my own hand, 21 years of the same boring rosary suddenly worth more than my truck. The beaver camera gave them the siphons, and the president holding the flashlight. The kid's phone, and mine, gave them, "I'm the president of the board, dig," said out loud, over a running engine, on land she'd been ordered off in writing by the state of Montana. That order was the difference between an expensive mistake and a crime. They were charged for destruction of a licensed dam, for violating the cease and desist, and for the wildlife counts, which were the ones with teeth. The civil side went to district court, where an 1889 water right is not a technicality but a loaded weapon. They hadn't inconvenienced a neighbor, they destroyed the most senior claim on the creek. Every dollar of downstream damage, 2 bridges, a county culvert, a neighbor's hay, landed on the party who did the digging, not the man who'd spent 3 months telling them not to. The pavilion was found intact against a fence line 2.5 miles down and photographed extensively by everyone in the valley. The septic inspection failed 41 for 41. The engineered replacement came in at a number I won't print, funded by an emergency assessment on every homeowner in Hartley Shores, plus the dam, plus the fish, plus the bridges. Those people paid for a view and ended up buying a lake, a sewer, and a hatchery. Errol Vance got out from under it by testifying to what the board had known and when. The rest of them are still paying. Corinne Pratt lost the presidency in 9 days and her license a good deal more slowly and more permanently once the state real estate board got interested in an agent who'd marketed 41 waterfront homes over water she knew she didn't own, above drain fields she knew were failing into it. Doug, I'm told, has moved. The kid in the excavator was never charged with anything. He testified, and the sentence, "I asked her if it was her property," did more damage than any lawyer in that room. The cattle were the part nobody puts in a newspaper. My pond was gone by noon on the 18th, and there is no water out here but the pond. I spent that fall hauling stock water in a 1,500-gallon tank on a flatbed, 3 trips a day, every day, and in November I sold off 90 head at a bad time in a soft market because I could not water them through another summer on a truck. That's what the whole thing actually cost me. And it's the number that's hardest to explain to people who think this story is funny. Which it is, right up until you're standing in a sale barn watching half your herd walk through the ring because a real estate agent needed a septic inspection to pass. The court put it in the judgment. The judgment doesn't put the cows back. It took 2 summers to get the pond. The dam's rebuilt now, properly, engineered, to a standard my great-great-grandfather would have found insulting and expensive. Dr. Halverson and her crew salvaged what survived down in the creek, a few hundred, less than we lost, more than nothing. And last June she came out and put their offspring back into full pool, and I stood on my own dam and watched a woman pour a bucket of fish into 130 years of water, and felt about how you'd expect. I read the new gauge that evening and wrote the number in the notebook because it's the same notebook. Then I hung the game camera back on the cottonwood. The beavers are already in the new spillway. 3rd week, they were in there stacking sticks like they'd never left. I went down with the pole and pulled it apart, and they had it half rebuilt by morning, and I stood there in the dark with my flashlight looking at these 2 idiots working away in my outlet, and I couldn't get properly mad. In 21 years of riding ditch, 4 years of retirement, and 130 years of family on this water, those beavers are the first neighbors I've ever had who understood what a dam is for. 3 feet. That's what all of it was for, and it's worth sitting with, because Corinne Pratt was never fighting for a view. She was fighting to dry out 41 drain fields 4 days before a state inspection, and she nearly pulled it off. Her mistakes came in a specific order. She voted on property she didn't own and mailed the victim the minutes, with her own remarks typed into them. She hired a consultant who recommended, by pure coincidence, the exact number her board had already passed. She ran siphons at night in front of a camera hung for beavers. She took a written cease and desist from the state of Montana and dug anyway, on video, saying the quiet part into a phone. And she did all of it to a man whose single most tedious habit, reading a gauge every morning for 21 years, became an unimpeachable timeline the moment she needed one not to exist. 3 things worth carrying out of this. Water rights run on seniority, not on votes.
A date like 1889 outranks anything a board can put on letterhead. An association's authority ends at its own boundary, and a resolution about your property is a piece of paper about a wish. And septic permits, plat maps, and as-built elevations are public records. The file that explains why someone is behaving insanely is usually sitting in a county office, free, waiting for anybody who thinks to ask. So here's what I want to know. Wade warned them in person, in certified mail, and out loud with a phone up 90 seconds before the bucket dropped. 3 warnings, and it still cost him half his herd. Would you have kept warning them, or stopped at 1 and let them dig? Tell me honestly, down in the comments.